Hi, everyone. I think we'll get started. So welcome to everyone here, to the panelists. Thank you for your time. We're going to have kind of a freewheeling discussion, I hope. Hope also that we can make it informative and fun. And I'm going to start by saying I think we have a lot of experience on the panel. I've been in the business a long time, and I think the one thing that I can say about the entertainment business in the last 30 years is that change has been constant. However, I also think that change has been accelerating in the last 5 to 10 years, beyond what it used to be. So I guess what I'd like to do is start out by asking kind of a general question. And I'm asking it in a way so that you can personalize it a little bit and connect who you are and where you're from, so that people can understand that. But if you were to be able to go back in time 5 years, 10 years, and tell your then self everything that you know now, how would you have changed what the last 5 or 10 years have been, or what would you be glad that you had done? So, do you want me to pick, or we can start in order? You want to go, Jeanette?
Yeah,
okay.
Fine. Can we go back 20 years? That would help me much better.
You can do that, yeah.
Well, I'm originally, as you hear from my accent, I'm from Germany, so I'm not really from here. So I learned the trade working at a network station in Germany. RTL Television, which is one of the larger network stations. And I love the 90s and the 80s. Everything seemed so easy, and prices were great. You can do sales, you can get great licensing fees, production budgets were fantastic, all was fun. At the time, we still thought, oh my God, these are low budgets. Now, we're dealing with low budgets, low pricing. So if I would change anything, I'd like to buy a crystal ball.
Hi, I'm Justin. Nice to meet you. I run a company that focuses on finding undervalued intellectual property that can be repackaged and reconfigured to be a high-value property that has multiple revenue streams. And I guess I might take a little bit of a counterpoint on what you said about change. I would say the slowest moving industry I've ever been associated with in terms of change is the entertainment business. It is notoriously the last mover in any aspect whatsoever, historically. It had no interest in the VHS. It fought tooth and nail to make sure that that didn't happen. If it were not for Warren Lieberfarb over at Warner Brothers, that would have never actually happened. They had no interest in the DVD. They kicked and screamed about transitioning from handmade animation to CGI until Pixar showed them differently. Social media was something they ignored. And if I were to use your timeline of 20 years ago, I worked for Microsoft in interactive TV, and it had just acquired web TV. My job was to come to Hollywood and explain to Peter Chernin and Jeff Berg and Michael Ovitz and all the people from, along with any other person in the ecosystem, that there was going to be a day very soon where content was going to appear on small devices, which back then were called handheld organizers. They were not connected via the internet, and you could watch clips of Jimmy Fallon, or at that time Jay Leno, and you could watch highlights of sporting things. And they literally thought we were out of our mind, that nobody would ever use that content. And again, they proved to be the mover of last advantage until Steve Jobs forced their hand. So I would say, if anything I have learned over my time in the entertainment industry is, if you want to know what's happening in the future, look at another industry, because that's what's happening. These people are just catching up to it.
Hello, my name is Steve, and I'm chairman of Region Entertainment and Here Media. As Jeanette mentioned, for years we made lots of movies, and they were successful and profitable. That was my company, Region Entertainment. About 10 years ago, we started our streaming businesses, and I think we were, fairly prescient regarding what was going to happen, and now we own 3 different cable and streaming services. We're busy losing cable subscribers and gaining streaming subscribers. We have one service aimed at the gay and lesbian audience that's been very successful for us, pays the bills. And I think, are going to have success with the 2 other services, one which has a strong gay audience, it's ad-supported. But what we have done a lot of, since we owned most of the gay media for about 10 years, and then sold it 2 years ago, thank God, we've learned how to sell advertising, and so that's something we can do. And as Justin mentioned, you have to look at other industries in order to figure out what you're going to do. I don't really know that I would look back and say that we screwed it up. I think we actually did what needed to be done. And, you know, we're very tiny in terms of our streaming services, but they're profitable, unlike Netflix and unlike most of the other services out there. And we're, you know, methodically building size. So I would have to say that it's okay. We aren't geniuses, but we're functional.
My name is Daryl Miller. Good afternoon. I am the chair of an entertainment and sports department at a national law firm called Fox Rothschild. I'm based in the Los Angeles office, and we have 27 offices around the country and 950 lawyers throughout the U.S., and a couple of partner firms internationally. If I had to look back 5 years, Adrian, I would have bought some Netflix stock. It's for me, one of the ways into kind of differentiating myself has been to really embrace kind of this digital revolution. So I've been in it for a while, but 5 years ago, we were thinking, just beginning to think a lot about, shorter form content competing with long form content, really starting to debate whether 30 minutes and 60 minutes would kind of rule the future. I've always believed that in the digital space, new things would happen. So probably 5 years ago, I probably should have told more clients to think outside the box, not continue to kind of live by the rules of traditional broadcast and traditional cable, but to be more aggressive in finding creative ways to express their creativity through short form content.
My name is Brian Beckman. I work with a company called ArcLight Films. We're out of Australia. We were one of the early adopters, or I don't want to say pioneers, but we spent the last 18 years really trying to get into the China market. And we've had a lot of success there, and if I had to look back about 10 years, I'd probably have doubled down my investment in China because it's the one exploding territory that independent filmmaking, from the Western point of view, really hasn't penetrated. And we're excited about what we've got going on there, but again, if I had to look back 10 years ago, I would have certainly doubled down my investment in China, and I probably would have doubled down on intellectual property in the superhero market.
All right, thanks, guys. So this panel is about deal making, so I'd like to ask a question directly about that. The established streaming platforms have been getting bigger and more powerful, and even as we speak, there's a big streaming platform launching today and another one that launched 10 days ago, and 2 or 3 more to come in the next few months. So how has the advent of all of these options impacted deal making in the areas that you guys work in?
I work primarily in financing. So the company I work for, Line Cinema, is known for funding movies and television shows, which I forgot to mention earlier. So the way it affects me is that I'm finding myself having a hard time structuring in a financial model that makes sense for my investors. Historic models, pre-sales, tax credits, equity, bank loans, have shifted significantly, and it's very hard to figure out what the streaming services contribution does to that model. And because it is a little unknown as to what is being paid by streaming services, how streaming is monetized. It is very hard for me to go to my investor and say, here is what you're going to be making from streaming, because I'm guessing. I had a long conversation yesterday with colleagues who I'm creating a new fund with, and we were trying to figure out what are we going to put in for streaming revenues. And we were like, yeah, might as well guess, maybe 30, maybe 50, maybe 100% of the budget. No one knows, and it's not publicized, as you all know. So I think, as for me personally, having done mainly theatrical level movies with A-level stars, I have shifted a little bit into television also to kind of adapt to what I believe the demand is right now with streaming services and network stations. And it seems that with that shift, I can make a little bit more sense for my investors as it relates to financing that kind of content. But we're still figuring it out.
Deal making has changed, I think, because there's just simply more of it. There has been I think a ferocious appetite among the studios to compete, with the cablers who are competing with the streamers, all to create what I call tentpole content to drive eyeballs. So, with Disney just launching and Apple launching and all the various other players, we've just seen a huge uptick in just demand for writers and showrunners, producers, and actors, as a number of these streamers are now full-fledged competing with broadcasters and cablers for the same actors. So we see a lot more deal making. In the deal making, we're seeing significant shifts in what we traditionally know as profit participation. The MAGR, modified adjusted gross revenue participation, that we typically get from broadcast deals or cable deals. Well, if you think about the streaming systems, most of them they don't use the syndication or shopping model. They're trying to create content for their subscribers, for their system, and not use it anywhere else. As a result of that, there's no back end, and many of them, led by Netflix and Amazon and others, don't allow creators to participate in what we traditionally know as profit participation. Now, there are things like premiums and that are paid, as a one-time payment to kind of compensate for that. But, a change in the deal making, as you asked, Adrian, has really been this shift from, hey, I got 5% of modified adjusted gross until the life of that exploitation, I will be participating in that income stream, versus I've got maybe a piece of this pot that they're going to pay one time to all the participants, and no matter how much they run this thing, no matter where they run it within their system, I'll never see another dime after I get my premium and after I make my fees up front.
Well, as Daryl mentioned, streaming has really changed and accelerated the pace of the activity. However, in my opinion, it has wiped out the middle class, much as technology is doing in other areas, for filmmaking. As Jeanette mentioned, there used to be a robust market where you could intelligently piece together pre-sales and subsidies and make your film. Today, it seems to me that you're either in the business of pitching the Netflixes, the Amazons, the studios, and the Netflix and Amazon. The studios made a huge mistake, apropos to Justin's comment, because they facilitated Netflix's growth, and now they're going to spend, tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions, to try to catch up and compete in a crowded market. So basically, I think there's deal making at the A level and the A minus level, where people are pitching, the major streaming and other services. And then there's very low budget filmmaking. But the world that existed previously is a very dangerous world, which is the middle level, which is frankly where most of us reside. So our business has become making modest budget stuff for our own streaming services, pretty much, or pitching Netflix on the next big idea.
Can I just pick up on one thing you mentioned, which I think is important to understand, because I do think the understanding on where you are in the ecosystem is incredibly important to understanding how the deal making has either benefited or not benefited you as it changes. But I would take issue with the fact that I don't think the studios did anything that they didn't know they were doing by enabling Netflix. Because Netflix and any of its subsequent followers was just doing the exact same thing that HBO did 45 years ago, right? They all started out exactly the same way, an aggregator of third-party content. It just happens to be that what Netflix did was it figured out how to solve the last mile problem and go direct to consumer, which made it much more powerful, which is why Netflix could surpass it. But anybody who was in Silicon Valley in 2000 and saw Netflix, which was a DVD rental company, could have told you that Netflix was going to be a streaming media company. There wasn't some mystical thing that it just showed up. Now, that may not have been obvious to Hollywood because it wasn't part of what they were used to. They didn't understand it. They didn't like digital rights. But they were just doing the same thing that they've always done. They're always looking for new outlets to sell their content. It just happened to be that instead of creating an HBO, which was to some extent a threat, and then they acquired it, they created something that was even bigger than them that they had no control over. But now they're in it. They, again, last mover. They've caught up to it. Disney will probably do just as well as Netflix. They have the assets. So I think it's a little bit different, and I think that's always going to be the case. There's always going to be some entrepreneurs leading the entertainment industry slowly that then the majors catch up to.
I hear you loud and clear. I respectfully disagree.
That's okay. That's what the fun of a panel is.
Just to add to what Steve was saying a little bit earlier about the streaming services and the impact that it's had on independent filmmaking. The impact is severe. It's a very different model out there. And when I go to build the finance plan for a particular project, honestly, streaming isn't part of that particular discussion, just because Netflix isn't in that particular world that's buying those mid-level independent films. And occasionally they will, but they'll pick it up for a domestic play, which is just simply selling out a territory. So from our point of view, Netflix is a distributor that we go to and we sell particular territories to, but they have also really built up their infrastructure. They're doing their own stuff in-house, which is continuing that decline for the independent filmmaking industry. And so there are certain wonderful aspects of the streaming companies, and right now all of them are scrambling for content. We see a lot of uptick in the Asian markets because they are relatively new in that particular area and they're picking up content. So there are great aspects to those things, but for the independent film market, the streaming services, which everybody was hoping was going to take over for that black hole of the DVD market disappearing. It just is a very, very different market nowadays. So unless you are in the golden age of television and running and doing TV with Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, those guys out there, that model is extremely successful, very difficult, but in the aspects of independent filmmaking, it's not the game changer that a lot of people thought they were going to be.
So there's a specific aspect of the deals that I'm really curious what you guys think about. Where we've arrived in dealing with the streamers seems to be that they're committing to content in exchange for owning it perpetually, which is a different model, and buying out the back end. With the potential for more competition amongst those platforms, do you think that structuring will remain, or are we somewhere on an evolutionary curve that you think will change in the future?
I think that structure has to remain because, again, in the old days, they were buying content first for their system, but then to exploit it in a number of other systems internationally and things of that nature. And they made their money in the aggregate by, syndicating it for practical purposes, in various markets. The essence of these over-the-top, direct-to-the-consumer systems is to have, the goal is to have the biggest library, bigger than the next guy, in the case of Disney, and to have that consumer experience direct forever. and to have those subscribers pay those subscriptions for the exclusive content that's provided on their system. So the model is not designed to encourage the subscribers or the consumers to go outside of the ecosystem of that direct streamer. And so I think the deals are going to be made, you think of all of us as separate streaming systems, we're going to be making content, and I'm going to try to make content to make you want to pay for my subscription. Justin's going to make content for you to pay for his subscription. We're not going to share content because we're not just sharing subscription fees. And from that standpoint, it's going to be a war of the direct-to-consumer, digital relationship.
And this is how bad it is. Not only is the model not going to change, but like if you try and do a show in the past where you were going to want to license clips from multiple studios, let's just say you were doing something that required that, you won't even have access to it. Like Disney is not going to give you clips of Marvel movies to put in like the equivalent of, Tom Hanks does those CNN, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. They're not licensing that to you anymore. Literally, they won't even license clips outside of their own ecosystem. So it's even more stringent than just keeping the IP. They won't let any slices of it out because they want you to know that the exclusive place for everything Disney, no matter what it is Disney.
I'd just add a little bit more to that, and that is that I don't know why they would want to change. But why would a streamer change their particular model? I mean, they're getting a great deal. They're buying out a project, and they own it indefinitely. And so, what's their motive to change that? And all the streamers are doing it. It will be very fascinating to see how everything shakes out in the next 5 to 7 years. There'll be players that pull out. We've seen it not long ago in the record industry. Slightly different, but Sony was putting together their own streaming service. iTunes eventually won out with all of that. So if you want music, you go to iTunes.
Well, here's the answer to your question. What's going to make it change is another shift, right? I mean, that's the good news, is things have shifted so quickly. Just think about the music industry. We went from the dying music industry being pirated to streaming music that you sort of vaguely purchased in no real aggregated sense, to the iTunes store, which unleashed the first legitimate service. And within less than 5 years, the entire iTunes stores has collapsed, and we went to a sharing model of Spotify and Pandora, right? Now, which was because, why? There was too many different ways to buy it. So there will be another shift, whether it's this year or in 10 years, I couldn't tell you. But I'm sure there are people that are predicting that with 7 different streaming services, there's going to be a service that allows you to aggregate and just buy one service that picks from those, or some other version of it. That's what would change the model. On their own, they'll never change the model, just like on their own, TV would never have changed the model for syndication.
So competition isn't enough to affect it, is what I'm hearing from the panel.
Not of the same players competing in the same arena. It takes a third-party external source to pressure it, which is what it took in this instance. Netflix was an outlier. It was a tech company. It was not part of the system. It was outside of it. There was nobody inside that was doing any of this. Disney could have done this a long time ago.
Right.
Blockbuster could have done it before Netflix.
And just to bring this conversation back home again, and what this does, it impacts everybody that's trying to do an independent film or TV series. So as the big boys figure out the best way that they're going to get their content out there and dominate the industry, we are going to be in that position where our projects are going to be hurt by the industry changing.
And I want to put a positive spin on this. This sounds also depressing. I really think...
Don't do that.
I'm sorry. Can't help myself. I'm a financier, yes, but I'm also a filmmaker. I'm a producer. I've been doing this now for 25 years. It ages me a lot, but I've had the experience that good stories sell. I believe there is maybe I'm just too hopeful. I do believe that good content is something you should be doing right now and should be trying to sell to whomever is buying, exclusively or not exclusively, who cares. I think there is a huge demand for good ideas out there, and with all these new streaming services coming and fighting for content, I think it's a great time for independents. You might just have to be a little more, working harder on your development and not sending stories out that bore everyone to death. Just really work and make a good story, and try to go back to what is important. We all want to see good stories, and I believe all these platforms, all these network stations, all the sales agents and distributors are looking for that. So good story, good package, and off you go.
So I want to ask a question about that you just reminded me of. So I think there's something almost strange going on where you see in traditional media companies are consolidating, newer media companies with new business models are expanding. So do you think this is a golden age of opportunity for creators and all of the people that work with creators, or do you think it's a potential negative future?
I think it's a mix. I think for the A and A- talent, the people that have a relationship with the major streamers or who have a brand or a particular pedigree, there's huge opportunities, and they'll be working for multiple sources and making a lot of money. They won't own anything for the most part. But again, I think that the competition between the streamers for content will be for that fillet of talent that they all want. They don't want a lot of the people starting out or the people in the middle class. That doesn't mean that you can't break through. I mean, we make shows for the streamers. Every now and then we have an idea and something we've developed that is acceptable and they're excited about, and we make it and get paid a fee. But for us, the smart thing is to focus on our own streaming services. And one thing about streaming services competing, you have to be something to somebody. And a lot of these services do not really have a dramatic brand identity. Nobody kind of cares that a service comes from a particular studio, with the possible exception of Disney, which is a clear brand. But, the others, Peacock, HBO Max, does that really mean that much? Maybe HBO a little bit. But if you want to do your own streaming service and compete in that market, you have to have an audience and you have to be something that people identify with, even if it's modest. And it's going to be very interesting. One of the things I think is exciting is to watch these guys compete and spend money. It's going to be fascinating from an academic standpoint and a business history standpoint. Jeanette and I have been working for the last year on a book on the business of Hollywood, and we're having a wonderful time trying to figure out what to write because of what the changes are. But, we read everything we can, we talk to everybody we can, and we'll end up with our own opinions and point of view at the end of the day. But it's fascinating just to observe it from an intellectual standpoint.
If I may, I could give a scorecard that might help even break down that into more very practical ways to digest it, which is to say, volume, way up, net positive for everybody. There's more content being bought now than there's ever been before. Whatever the latest stat is on peak TV, right? Volume, way up. Diversity, more people, more voices, a long tail. Doesn't only have to, yes, of course, blockbuster movies like Avengers have done incredibly well, but if you look at a lot of the programming on Netflix or, you look at some of the stuff that they're doing, it's very niche. There would have never been a home for that before, and now there can be because they're aggregating audiences not just across the United States, but across the world. So diversity of voices, much more diverse than ever before. Revenue model for an individual producer or non-giant, gorilla in the woods, down, right? Lack of back end, speed to market, people making things much quicker. Obviously when a lot of these streamers came out, they allowed people to go straight to series, 2-season pickups, unheard of in the development cycle. So there's a variety of things that are pluses and negatives. It kind of depends on where you are sitting at any given moment. But there are a lot of positives to this, what's happening in the ecosystem. Obviously, the economic piece is a real challenge because I'm sure most people in the audience here are not running studios. And so as an individual, what does that mean for you? But it does mean that you have a chance to sell more different types of things. And that is a net positive for what I would imagine most people in this room are looking for.
What do you think it means for the creative community? For about 100 years, in starting with the film business, creative people, writers, actors, have been able to forge ownership in what they make, in partnership with all the distributors. And some of them, through that ownership over time, were able to generate significant amounts of wealth. So in a world where you're dealing with platforms, and it feels like leverage has moved over to the side of the platforms from the creators, how do you think it changes the people you deal with if they can be wealthy, but they may be highly paid employees like NBA superstars?
Well, I think it's a good way to make a living. And I think you're quite right. Some people are going to be paid like NBA superstars. I hate to be so boring, but again, it's very good for the A and A- talent. Justin's quite right. You look at the diversity of content that has come forth on the streaming services, it's rather extraordinary, and the different types of things. It's never been a better time to be part of a diverse ethnic group or sexual orientation group. I mean, on television, the area that we observe is, I read something the other day that said that almost something like 80% of all shows on major networks have a gay character or someone who's in an affinity group close to a gay character. And that, as Justin alluded to, that sort of thing was unheard of. It's a really good time for diversity right now, and you can say, and that's a very positive thing. I mean, that's something, apropos to Jeanette's need to be positive, that's a very positive and good thing for all of us. But I still insist that it's a challenge for us middle-class filmmakers, which I consider myself, and I think that will continue indefinitely. That doesn't mean that some of us won't break through and find a way to do something interesting and have and create, quality stuff, but it's a challenge. The creative people I work with are, I think, excited by it all, and they view this as a huge opportunity, but I don't know that it's making its way through to a lot of the folks. I think, again, it's a certain group of people who are really benefiting from this, who are at the upper levels, and the rest of us a bit more of a challenge.
But isn't that only really relevant if you've boxed yourself into traditional, theatrical distribution? I mean, let's just take, the cost to make something these days is so vastly minuscule compared to 10 years ago. Let's just take the sort of godfather of low-cost horror films, Jason Blum, right? He made Paranormal for $10,000 or $100,000 or some nominal amount, and it grossed some ridiculous amount of money, right? And he's built an entire studio off of that model, which was basically do it for really, really inexpensive. Robert Rodriguez did some of that. The people at Awesomeness TV, they built TV shows and movies that were fractions of what could be done within this unionized system, and they completely own the product. They completely own the consumer. They built up their own mini studios that sold for hundreds of millions of dollars. Maker Studio would be another example of that. And I know that's not traditional long-form theatrical distribution, but that business is where you say it is. I agree with you. That business is challenged right now. But there's many, many other ways to do it, and there's never been less expensive to do it, with more distribution options that have nothing to do with major studios.
I hear you loud and clear.
Are we going to disagree again or agree? I can't tell. You flip-flop. I feel like there's one or the other coming.
There is real love there.
How many content creators do we have in the room by show of hand?
Here we go.
And how many distributors of any kind, form of content do we have by show of hands? Okay, so it's still predominantly content creators, yeah. I'm going to jump on the optimism train and believe.
All
you know,
right,
look,
welcome,
they're-
choo-choo.
because at
I
no
love it.
time in the history of this business has there been just more content being created. And the idea of diversity is not, again, some great wisdom and some great insight and some desire to do it, as much as I think it is a consumer compelling it to happen. Again, most of us grew up in an environment where we were all told to be at home at 8 o'clock to see who shot JR. We were all basically told what movies we'd watch and how we'd watch it when we watch it. The game changer of the digital revolution has been the consumer taking the power and the diversity of the consumers demanding, different shifts in content. So when you talk about gay, African American, Latino, anything that's happening out there, is really trying to capture that consumer, because now the data is actually reading what those consumers are doing, and the consumers as a community can go to a platform where they see themselves, and they're turning away from platforms that they don't see themselves, that they didn't have any choices or alternatives in the past. So I have, personally, we represent A players, and we represent B players, and we represent D players coming into the business. But for this room, I suspect a number of us are, you work in the middle class or even lower class. I have a couple of small production companies that are overwhelmed with work because, at 2 million and below, let's be very specific, because we are talking about big ranges up here. Let's say 2 million and below. We're finding that there are a lot of buyers who are looking for people that can make smarter content for a price. And there are, at least the companies that I have are going crazy, and it's like at the candy store for the first time, because they have a reputation for making product for a price. They don't have a huge amount of overhead. They have a lot of independent, contractors that they can build up and do production pretty quickly. And it is quite a good time for them. I have one who's done so well. He's actually not Tyler Perry, but he's bought 3 of his own sound stages in addition to his production company, in addition to building a library of films for himself. So I do see, for those who kind of can shift and move with technology and the time and find where the opportunities are, I do see a proliferation and opportunity for kind of, I think what Brian's calling the middle class. Now, if you're middle class making $8 million or $10 million films, right, because we have to define what that middle class is, it can be a little bit harder, because those small micro-budgeted players, it's really hard to aggregate $8 million for a film and then 16 or 8 to 16 million to market it. But if you're under 2.5, there's a decent business out there. And you can sell and make 150 or so to a streamer. You can sell to airplanes. You can sell to hotels. You can sell to a couple of cable linear programs, and actually make back your money and have a business. So it depends how we define middle class, and it depends where you are in the pendulum of the ability to say, hey, look, I've got this 20th century business that I'm trying to move into the 21st century, and it can be really, 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 really hard if you can't turn the corner as easy as someone who's starting up. That's where the challenge is, transition.
And for all those creative individuals out there that are interested in, or their foundation is building that type of content, I can't stress enough that you have to take a global view. Everybody's so interested, and we really haven't talked about it except for myself, because if anybody was out at AFM, those are the people that you're selling your content to. Not the people in the theaters, not the people that are watching at home. You're selling it to those 200 distributors that are AFM buying your product. They want to know that you have something that's going to cross borders and sell, not just in the US, not just in Europe, but Latin America, Asia, China, Australia, across all those borders. Now, you can make content that is very localized and specialized, but you also have to make that for that particular market. If it's that, so your budget will go from 5 million down to 500,000 if you're making a Turkish movie. So that's just what you have to deal with. That is the reality, that if you are making content, it has to cross borders. Otherwise, your budget has to be driven by what you're doing. So I can't stress enough that if everybody in here who's making content, you have to keep that global perspective open.
So, Brian, I wanted to ask a follow-up on that. So the independent film model has been around probably since the early 80s, where movies, and this is a film question, but I'd like to know if anyone feels it applies to other formats. It's an international sales support to greenlight a film, which gets sold to those 200 plus buyers at AFM and at other markets and distributed through their local systems. It feels like that model is under siege. So maybe it's a budgetary issue. Maybe I would ask if you think it creates further impetus for localized creation, so more local production. But do you think that model can continue?
Well, if I may, probably not. Hope is not a business plan. And if you are making a movie at any kind of real budget, you're taking a huge risk unless you've pre-sold it to somebody. The various distributors at AFM, some of them are doing well, many of them are on their last legs. They're not making money, and they're all challenged. The thought that you or I can make a movie for $2 million or 100,000 that's going to make 100 million, that's a fluke. Could happen, but 99% of the time, it's not going to happen, and you're going to lose your money or the investor's money unless you're prepared to either sell to somebody and sell all the rights or keep your budgets very, very low. What's exciting are people who are making movies for 100,000 and making 200,000. That's kind of the similar model to what used to be making a movie for $2 million. $2 million's a huge budget. That's a lot of money. Not many of us have $2 million sitting around somewhere. And people think that's a low budget. It ain't. That's a lot of money. So if you're okay losing your money or your investor's money, then have at it. But it's a very dangerous time right now to try to do those kinds of things, in my humble opinion.
I see a lot of traction in different areas, as Steve was just mentioning. Certainly in the sub 2 million range, there are some exciting creative stuff being done. And it is down to story and concept and idea. That's how you get it sold. But most of the distributors that I've met with over the last week and a half or so, there's a healthy appetite out there, but it's for those producers and sales agents that are creating content that's $15 to $20 million. Now that's starting to get into the upper region of independent filmmaking. And so it is one of those things where a lot of distributors are looking for that type of content because they want to know that you have A-list players in your movie. They want to know that it's going to have a certain level of production value. If you get under the 2 million, then you start, it's much more risky. So we see there's been a very healthy appetite for the projects that we've had that have been $15 to $20 million. So again, that doesn't mean that that's how your budget should be. But again, if it can cross borders, then there is a healthy market out there. Will it continue? Of course it'll continue. The next year they'll want it for $30 million budgets, but they only want to pay for the traditional $10 million price tag. So, and there's also a lot of creative ways that you can structure financing. And again, it's a very global industry. You have to take the entire market, the global market, into perspective. I'm seeing huge numbers out of China, but you have to know how to tap into it. You need to know that particular financing model.
I also think you have to think about structuring some of the funding from other places. What I have done recently, yes, of course, historically we've worked with equity investors, we still do that, but there is money from brands out there. I just finished 2 seasons of a television series which was partially funded by investors, partially funded through branding. And when I say branding, I don't mean product placement where you see the Coke bottle and the logo and all is well. I mean organic integration where you integrate a brand into your story flow. The other suggestion I would make in talking about the global market, which I think is important, there are fantastic tax credits out there, not just in the US, but internationally. I'm putting together a television series that is shot in Europe, and I'm covering 60% of my budget out of Germany and Belgium. So there is money there, and I'm not paying that back, by the way, so hallelujah to my investors. So just think about looking into other corridors, into areas where you can offset what could have historically been a pre-sale. And I do think that for A-level cast-driven projects, as you mentioned, I am seeing still some pre-sales, so it's not like entirely dead. It is a little more difficult, the price tags are a little lower, but it is not entirely impossible. But trying to differentiate your sources, being very scrutinizing with your equity, protecting your equity, I think is important also for the long run. We have historically put into our budgets, which are in the 15 to 25 million range on the A-level stuff that we're doing. We're capping that at about 35%. So we are trying to stay, well, sometimes it's 40 if I'm entirely crazy about something, but I'm trying to protect the equity in a way that I'm not having someone give me an entire check for my movie and say, here, 100% equity, thank you very much. Yes, of course, it's easier, but it's very unhealthy. So trying to find other sources in brands, in tax credits, international co-productions, these are things that I would look for at this time.
Yeah, there's a very healthy industry out there with soft dollars.
Yeah.
And for anybody that's doing independent filmmaking, it's your job to scour the world as to know where the best places to shoot your movie. It might be in Colombia, it might be in Puerto Rico, it might be in Thailand, it might be in Australia, it might be in Canada. Those are all places that I've shot in the last 2 years. And so it's important that you know where you are going to maximize your tax credits and the other soft money, whether it be grants or subsidies, payroll taxes, incentives. Those are all extremely important. And it's your guys' responsibility to be able to do that, because if you come to me with a project, I expect you to know, what you're doing and how you're going to maximize that. Because the more money that you can put on the screen, the better your film is going to be able to be sold.
All right, so this may be a loaded question, and Justin, I'd like you to answer first.
Fantastic. Load it up.
Is this the best time ever to buy a library or revitalize IP, or the best time to sell?
I think it basically is both, right? As, what is it, the best of times or worst of times? There's never been a bit more hunger for intellectual property. Now, at the same time, what they want is fully developed intellectual property. People think Marvel has developed intellectual property. The truth of the matter is, 10 years ago, if you had tried to pick, 10 years ago they made Iron Man. If you had gone 11 years ago and said, here's the idea, Iron Man's the center of this 22-movie universe, they would have laughed you out of the room, right? Right? It didn't make any sense. I mean, they're like, who cares about Iron Man, right? And it just didn't work. They couldn't get anything over besides Batman and Superman for many, many years. So on one level, there's a ton of undervalued. This land that we live in is the king of shiny objects. So that means there's a lot of really good stuff left by the wayside that is just sitting there in pockets if you know where to look or you're willing to put in the time. So from that perspective, there's a ton of great stuff to buy. On the other hand, right, if you can find it, it's no better time to actually sell it to people, because they want Atari remakes, they want, someone just sold something, I think, to Screen Gems based on like a dance video game. So it is actually both, which is actually what you need to make it valuable. Because if it was just the greatest time to actually sell it, but you couldn't acquire it, there's no model, and vice versa. So you have to, so right now is the best of both worlds. There's tons of it out there, and everybody wants it. And the studios are the slowest moving beasts in the jungle, so they're not going to be the ones that are going to find it unless it comes off the bestseller list, which allows independent producers like you to be in a very privileged position because you're hustlers. You're going to make it happen. You're going to find it. You're going to wheel and deal it. You're going to find the undervalued podcast, that thing that got lapsed, that was in turnaround. That's where you can make your mark and where you can actually own something that is better than just starting from scratch.
Justin, when you refer to intellectual property for your purposes, are you talking about a concept or a story that can be developed into a movie or a series? Are you contrasting that with intellectual property in the form of film libraries? Is that a different animal for you?
I'm actually talking about any and all of the above. It really depends on where you are personally and what you're good at. Some people might have the ability to purchase film libraries or intellectual property, but I'll just tell you, I sold a movie based on public domain intellectual property, right? That's free. It's in the public domain, and I took that and said, here's a really great title that will resonate and sound like it's really great IP because people will know it. And then I put a spin on it creatively, and I then walked into a studio that bought it based on that pitch, right? So it really depends, but finding something that you own that feels like it gives them something more is always the key to the game, right? It's laddering up. Does that answer your question?
It's important to know that not all IP is created equally.
Of course
so it's when we're talking about intellectual property, you could be talking about a book that has been, beloved by all their fans. Doesn't mean it's going to be a great movie. You might find something that's amazing, or something that's in public domain now. I mean, we're doing a contemporary version of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. We're shooting it right now with Michael Caine in the UK, and the numbers don't lie. And the fact is that if you do have some sort of branded IP or branded materials that you're using, the numbers will be higher than non-branded or self-created. There's nothing wrong with that. It does help, but it doesn't mean that all IP is created equal. So if you're out there and that's all you're doing, it's a jump start, but it doesn't mean that it's going to make your movie any different than something that you created yourself. So it's important to remember that it's all about the idea, the concept, the script, and what you create it from there. And the sad fact is that if all the scripts were destroyed, by tomorrow morning there would be enough scripts to be able to cover every inch of LA. So it's one of those things that there are amazing scripts out there, and don't stop writing, don't stop creating. That's really important. Don't leave everything on your one project. You always have to continue to be creating.
But don't you think, I mean, of course not all IP is created equal. I mean, let's just look at Disney, right? They just made a movie out of Jungle Cruise, which is a great thing. It's got The Rock and Emily Blunt, and so it'll probably do, I don't know if it'll make its money back or not, but it'll probably certainly open up to some number. And they did Pirates of the Caribbean, which was based on both the Disney rides, which there's no story, there's no real IP around it. There's nothing. And then they made Haunted House, which was the same thing, right? And it didn't work. But the point being is, if you're looking for a leg up in this middle market, there's nothing that's short of a story, right? Jungle Cruise works if it works because it's got a great story, not because you remember taking that ride when you were 12 years old. Same as with Pirates of the Caribbean. But if you're trying to get people's attention, it's a lot easier to get people's attention when they start with something that they already have some idea with. So if you're going to be creative and you're going to reinvent something and you're going to put your talents to work, you might as well try and start with something that at least starts you at a level where you can cut through the clutter easier. Because the truth of the matter is most buyers would rather take a safe route, and saying it's based on some form of IP, even if it's just the name of a ride, makes people feel better. And that's part of what your job is as a salesperson, is to know their needs.
So if you're presenting that, let's say a filmmaker is presenting something to you or somebody else, do they present just a concept that's a really cool concept, or do they present that with a story? What's the package you want to see?
I think in a perfect world, you want to see an entire thing. You want to say, I just acquired the rights to, out of a public domain Jane, I have a take on a public domain Jane Austen novel that is well known, and here we're going to turn it into vampires instead of traditional love story. Or, I'm going to take, the Ten Commandments and turn it into a rom-com, or whatever it is. I mean, whatever that is, I think obviously the more you can do, the more it will sell. Like, not everybody can walk in the room and just go, like Griffin Mills in The Player, it's about two suns. Who plays the suns? No, they're planets. The more you can walk in with, the better. And the package is, in my mind, IP, great story, script, and attached talent or director. Like, that's ideal. But you can't always do that. So you have to do as close as you can.
So we've only got 5 minutes left. I'd like to ask you, for our audience that's full of creators, independent producers, do you think that their path to getting their creative material seen is the same as it's always been? Are there more gatekeepers? Do the gatekeepers have more people to talk to? How do you think it is for them today compared to the past? Or where you think it's going?
Where it is, I think, again, there are just more opportunities than ever before. And again, if you free your mind from the traditional studio film, from traditional 1 hour, half hour, you start thinking about short form content, you start thinking about reaching your consumers yourself through digital platforms. There's just more ways for creators to reach consumers, to even test an idea to find out if it is going to have a bigger appeal. So I think it's the best of times. Now, we are in a huge transition. So that transition is not going to look the same, I predict, 5 years from today as it does today. We're going to see a shakeout with all of these digital players competing for our dollars over the next year and a half, right? We're going to see a shakeout from the consolidation of the vertically integrated companies getting bigger and bigger and bigger and just trying to, do their version of capturing consumers to only buy their products. That's going to continue to happen. But one thing is constant: they will always need content. And they'll always need content to attract consumers. They'll always need content, I think, to exploit underlying IP. And our essence of our business, entertainment, is about content. So I think in a landscape where there are more distributors for consumers to reach that content, it's a good world, and it will continue to be a better world for content creators in the short term.
Well, it's like a tale of two cities. It's the best of times and the worst of times. If you are a creative producer who writes and has the skills to show run, I think the opportunities are unlimited if you have those abilities. If you are a financial producer, I think it's a much tougher time. A person who puts together financing, who hires the people, and by the way, that's, I've written a lot, but I consider myself a financial producer. I put together the deals. That's what I do. I do film financings. As we've discussed on this panel, I think it's very changing, very tricky. You have to really try to understand, the streaming markets and recognize that the old way of doing things that we really enjoyed for many years does not exist anymore. So, you have to adapt, and the way our companies have adapted is by creating our own streaming services and creating content for those streaming services, and that's what's worked for us. But, that is available, as the several panel members have alluded to. That's available to anyone given the changes in technology. So, there's light at the end of the tunnel, and it may not be an approaching train.
I guess I would end on the note that it is an important question, but I wonder whether it's a relevant question, which is to say, no matter what, we are where we are, right? The state of the market is the state of the market, and whether we would like it to be different, at any given time, no matter who you are, there's somebody who wants something to be slightly different. And so I end on this quote from Bruce Lee, who once said, water takes the shape of any object it is in. If it's in a teacup, it is the shape of a teacup. If it's in a river, it becomes the rolling nature of a river. Water always finds the opening. Be water, my friend. And to you, my friends out there, be water. Find that opening. Roll with what's happening. It is the market that is today. You don't need to worry about what it's going to be like in 5 years. You need to worry about how you get your current project that you most care about, or your top 5 things, out in the marketplace. And you need to find that opening, just like Bruce Lee said.
I think there is no reason to go beyond a Bruce Lee quote. We are done. I really want to thank all of you for coming and sharing your thoughts, and all of you for coming and listening. So, we're done. Never heard Bruce Lee.